Think about the most photographed, most theorized, most argued over structures in the history of human civilization. Not the Colosseum, not Stonehenge, not the temples of Angkor Wat, the pyramids at Giza. Nearly 15 million people visited Egypt's heritage sites in 2023, the highest number ever recorded. 15 million, and a huge portion of them made the same pilgrimage, stood at the same plateau, looked up at the same stones, and felt the same thing, that this shouldn't be possible. That feeling is where everything begins, and it's also where things get complicated, because the pyramids exist at the intersection of two very different worlds. In one world, they are archaeological monuments, physical records of an ancient civilization's ambition, labor, engineering knowledge, and belief about death and the cosmos. In the other world, they are a cultural battleground, a place where fringe theories, half-truths, and genuine unsolved mysteries pile on top of each other until nobody's sure what's real and what's been invented to fill the gaps. The same 5 claims keep coming back, decade after decade, that aliens or a lost advanced civilization built the pyramids because humans couldn't have, that the workers were slaves driven to their deaths under the whips of Pharaoh's overseers, that hidden chambers and secret passages still lie undiscovered, concealing knowledge the ancient Egyptians didn't want found, that the construction required technology we still don't fully understand, and that the pyramids were deliberately aligned with the stars, specifically the Belt of Orion, as part of a cosmic design that encoded something far beyond a tomb. Some of these claims have a kernel of observable reality at their core. Some are built entirely from argument by incredulity, the idea that because we find something hard to explain, it must have a sensational explanation. And some fall apart the moment you hold them against what we actually know. Here's what's changed recently. The mystery has gotten sharper. Not in the way conspiracy theorists predicted, but in a way that's arguably more interesting. Modern scanning technology, muon tomography, ground-penetrating radar, ultrasonic imaging, electrical resistivity mapping has begun revealing what's actually inside these structures without touching a single stone. In 2017, researchers disclosed a massive void above the Grand Gallery inside the Great Pyramid, a space that had never been documented. Then in 2025, a peer-reviewed paper in Scientific Reports confirmed the existence of a previously unknown corridor on the north face, verified through multiple independent imaging methods fused together into 3-dimensional data. These are real discoveries, confirmed by science, and their purpose is still being debated. That distinction matters enormously. Genuine uncertainty is not evidence of conspiracy. A hidden corridor doesn't mean the Egyptians were hiding alien technology. An unexplained void doesn't mean the pyramid was an energy generator. What it means is that a structure built 4,500 years ago still has things to teach us, and that the tools to learn them are only now catching up. At the same time, excavations at the Giza workers' village have produced DNA evidence, isotope studies, and detailed physical records of the people who actually built these structures. What those records show directly contradicts the oldest and most persistent myth of them all. But the slave story hasn't gone anywhere, in part because new evidence rarely travels as fast as old mythology. Conspiracy-style content spreads faster than corrections, and research into how YouTube's recommendation algorithm works shows that once a viewer watches one sensational pyramid video, the system feeds them more, pulling them deeper into a loop that's difficult to reverse. That's the landscape this video is working in. So here is the method. 3 categories kept separate throughout. What is confirmed by physical evidence and peer-reviewed research? What is a plausible interpretation that hasn't been ruled out? And what remains genuinely open, unknown, unresolved, and honestly fascinating? The pyramids deserve that kind of clarity. Not because the truth is boring, but because the actual truth, the verified, excavated, scanned, and measured truth, is more remarkable than most of the myths that have replaced it. So let's start with what we actually know. Before any of the theories, before the aliens and the energy fields and the star maps, there is a basic historical context, and it changes everything about how you read the pyramid. The Great Pyramid at Giza was commissioned by Pharaoh Khufu, 4th dynasty, Old Kingdom Egypt, somewhere around 2580 to 2560 BC. That's not a disputed date. That's not an estimate pulled from speculation. It's a figure backed by radiocarbon dating, inscriptions, and a continuous body of archaeological evidence accumulated over more than a century of excavation. Khufu ruled at a time when Egypt was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated administrative states on earth. The Old Kingdom wasn't some mysterious prehistoric civilization operating at the edge of human capability. It had professional scribes, centralized grain distribution, a functioning treasury, a standing priesthood, and a government capable of organizing labor at a scale that modern supply chains would recognize. The pyramid was built as a tomb. That's the foundational fact, and it matters more than it sounds, because a tomb in ancient Egypt was not simply a place to put a body. It was a machine, a precisely constructed theological instrument designed to transform the king from a mortal man into something permanent. The pyramid texts, which are among the oldest religious writings in human history, make the function explicit. These spells and incantations, carved into the walls of slightly later Old Kingdom pyramids, describe in remarkable detail what the pyramid was supposed to accomplish. They provide the spells needed to enable the deceased pharaoh's transformation into an AKH, a kind of transfigured, luminous spirit capable of existing in the realm of the gods. They describe resurrection. They describe the king's spirit ascending, using imagery of ramps and ladders and even flight, to join the daily voyage of the sun god Ra across the sky. The pyramid wasn't a monument to the ego of one man. It was a resurrection machine, purpose-built and cosmologically justified. The pyramid's very shape was part of the theology. Those sloping sides weren't just an engineering solution to stacking large amounts of stone. They were deliberately symbolic of the sun's rays breaking through clouds and touching the earth, a visual representation of the divine pathway the pharaoh's soul would travel. The Egyptians called this shape the Benben, connecting it to the primordial mound that rose from the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation. Every angle of that structure was a statement about the relationship between the king, the gods, and the cosmos. You cannot evaluate the pyramid without understanding that it was built to operate on that level, physically, symbolically, and religiously all at once. But here's where the isolated stone puzzle framing really breaks down. Because the Great Pyramid was never meant to stand alone, what exists at Giza is not a pyramid. It's a complex and integrated royal necropolis designed to serve the king's afterlife and to project state power across the living world simultaneously. Khufu's pyramid sits at the center of a program that includes a valley temple at the edge of the floodplain, connected by a long causeway leading up the plateau to a mortuary temple on the pyramid's eastern face. Surrounding the main structure are 3 subsidiary pyramids, often called the Queen's Pyramids, built for members of the royal family. There are mastaba tombs for high officials fanning out in organized rows, their placement relative to the king's monument reflecting their status in life and in death. There are boat pits, actual pits containing dismantled wooden boats intended for use in the afterlife, including the famous Khufu boat, one of the oldest intact vessels ever discovered, sealed for over 4,000 years before its excavation in 1954. Every element of that landscape was connected. Every piece served a purpose within the logic of Old Kingdom religious thought. The Valley Temple is where the king's body was received, purified, and prepared. The causeway was a transitional passage, physically and symbolically, between the world of the living and the domain of the dead. The mortuary temple is where priests would perform the ongoing rituals that kept the king's ka, his life force, sustained for eternity. Without those rituals, without that constant maintenance of memory and offering, the pyramid itself was incomplete. The stone was only one part of the system. This is why the framing of the Great Pyramid as an isolated, mysterious object, A stone puzzle dropped in the desert by unknown hands for unknown reasons is not just historically wrong, it's structurally misleading. It strips away exactly the context that makes the pyramid explicable. When you remove the causeways, the temples, the boat pits, the surrounding cemeteries, the texts, the theology, and the administrative records of the civilization that produced it, what you're left with is a giant stack of stone with no apparent origin and no apparent purpose. And a giant stack of stone with no apparent origin or purpose is an irresistible invitation for every kind of invented explanation. Understanding what the ancient Egyptians themselves said about kingship, about death, and about monumentality is the foundation for everything else in this conversation. Egyptian kingship was not primarily political in the way we understand it. The pharaoh was a cosmic figure, the living embodiment of the god Horus while alive, and the dead god Osiris after death. His continued existence in the afterlife was not a personal reward, it was a necessity for the maintenance of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order that kept the Nile flooding on schedule, the crops growing, the sun rising. The pharaoh who successfully completed his transformation into an AKH was not just a dead king resting in peace. He was a functional participant in the ongoing operation of the universe. That belief system produced a very particular kind of ambition when it came to monument building. Size was not vanity, scale was function. The bigger and more permanent the structure, the more effectively it could serve as the container for royal power across eternity. Old Kingdom pyramid building escalated dramatically across generations, from Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara to the bent pyramid and red pyramid at Dashur to the three massive monuments at Giza, because each pharaoh was working within a framework that treated architectural ambition as theological necessity. The Great Pyramid is the largest and most technically refined expression of that escalating tradition. It is the apex of something that had been developing across multiple generations and multiple reigns. None of that is suppressed knowledge. None of it requires a leak from a secret archaeological establishment to access. It's in the texts, in the temples, in the burial goods, in the administrative records, and in the physical layout of the plateau itself. And this is why getting the original purpose right is not just an academic starting point. It's the necessary foundation for evaluating everything that comes later. The slave myth, the alien theories, the hidden energy claims, the selective star maps, all of them depend to varying degrees on the premise that the pyramid doesn't fit into the world that produced it, that it's anomalous, that it's inexplicable, that there's a gap between human capability in 2560 BC and the thing that exists on that plateau. Once you actually understand what that world was, the organizational power of the Old Kingdom state, the theological logic driving the construction, the integrated complexity of the full Giza complex, that gap starts to close. Not completely, not without some genuinely unresolved questions about method and logistics, but structurally, purposively, culturally, the Great Pyramid makes sense inside the civilization that built it. The mystery is real, but the mystery lives in the details of how, not in the question of why. And keeping those two things clearly separated is the only way to take the next step without losing your footing. So if the mystery lives in the details of how, and it does, then the most important thing happening in pyramid research right now is not happening with shovels or chisels. It's happening with particle physics. For most of the 20th century, the only way to find out what was inside the Great Pyramid was to cut into it. That meant drilling, tunneling, and in some cases causing damage that can never be undone. The trade-off was brutal. You either learned something and destroyed part of the structure in the process, or you left it alone and stayed ignorant. For a monument that has been standing for 4,500 years, neither option felt acceptable. That constraint defined archaeology at Giza for generations. Then muon tomography arrived, and it changed the equation entirely. Muons are subatomic particles produced constantly and naturally when cosmic rays, streams of high-energy radiation from outside our solar system, collide with molecules in Earth's upper atmosphere. They rain down on every surface on Earth at all times, passing through solid matter the way X-rays pass through soft tissue. The denser the material they encounter, the more of them are absorbed before they get through. If you place a muon detector beneath or beside a large stone structure, you can measure that absorption pattern, and anywhere the stone is less dense than expected, more muons arrive. A void, a corridor, a chamber, anything that isn't solid limestone leaves a detectable signature in the data. The Scan Pyramids project used 3 different types of muon detectors simultaneously: plastic scintillators, nuclear emulsions, and micropattern gaseous detectors. Those aren't 3 versions of the same instrument. They're 3 fundamentally different technologies operating on overlapping principles, which means that anything all 3 agree on is extremely unlikely to be an artifact of measurement error. In 2017, that methodology produced one of the most significant discoveries in Egyptian archaeology in decades: a previously unknown large void inside the Great Pyramid, sitting above the Grand Gallery, roughly the size of a commercial aircraft fuselage. Scientists called it the Big Void. What it is: a relieving chamber, an unfinished passage, something deliberate, remains actively debated, but its existence is not in doubt. The catch with muon tomography is time. Getting statistically meaningful data from muon detectors requires months of continuous collection. The particles arrive at random, so you need large numbers of events before the signal separates cleanly from the background noise. That means muon maps are built slowly, and their spatial resolution, while impressive for the technique, is limited compared with what you can get from surface-based methods working at shorter range. You can see that something is there. You cannot always resolve exactly how big it is or what shape it takes. That's where a second family of techniques comes in. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending short pulses of electromagnetic energy, radio waves in the 200 to 800 megahertz range, into limestone from the surface. When those pulses encounter a boundary between 2 materials with different electrical properties, say dense stone meeting an air-filled gap, some of the energy reflects back toward the surface like an echo. The time it takes for that reflection to return tells you how deep the boundary is. The strength of the reflection tells you something about how dramatic the contrast is. In the Scan Pyramids research confirmed in the 2025 Scientific Reports paper, a 300 MHz antenna gave sub-meter resolution with measurement grid spacings as tight as 50 to 200 millimeters. That level of detail is close enough to map structural features that muon tomography can only gesture at. Ultrasonic testing works on a similar echo principle, but with sound rather than radio waves. High-frequency shear wave pulses, around 25 kHz, are introduced into the stone through direct contact, and the time it takes for reflections to return from internal surfaces reveals both the depth and the nature of what's down there. Air-filled voids reflect ultrasonic pulses very strongly because the acoustic impedance difference between limestone and air is enormous. Wave velocities in the range of 1.3 to 2.2 kilometers per second allow researchers to calculate how deep those reflectors sit at measurement steps as small as 100 millimeters. Electrical resistivity tomography takes a completely different approach. Electrodes are placed against the stone surface. Current is injected into the material, and voltage differences are measured at multiple points around the array. Stone and air conduct electricity very differently. Air-filled cavities have dramatically higher electrical resistivity than solid limestone. By modeling how the current distributes through the material beneath the surface, researchers can build a 3-dimensional picture of where the resistivity is anomalously high. In the North Face corridor work, dipole-dipole electrode arrays spaced just 0.25 meters apart produced volumetric resistivity maps that independently confirmed what the radar and ultrasonic data were showing. Here is why using all of these methods together matters more than any one of them alone. Each technique has its own failure modes. Ground-penetrating radar loses penetration depth as limestone density increases. Ultrasonic testing requires surface contact and works best at relatively shallow depths. Muon tomography takes months and produces coarser spatial maps. Resistivity imaging can be influenced by surface moisture or material variation that has nothing to do with internal voids. But the features that show up in all four datasets simultaneously, appearing as anomalies in the radar reflections, in the ultrasound returns, in the resistivity volumes, and in the muon absorption patterns at the same location, those are features that cannot be explained away by any single instrument's limitations. The final step is image fusion. Using a mathematical technique called discrete wavelet transform, researchers align and merge the GPR, ultrasonic, and resistivity reconstructions into a single integrated three-dimensional model. The fusion process doesn't just stack images on top of each other, it identifies where overlapping datasets agree, amplifies the features they share, and suppresses the noise and artifacts that appear in only one data stream. The result is a higher resolution model of internal anomalies than any individual scan could produce on its own, one that provides volumetric information, actual estimates of size and shape that you simply cannot get any other way. And crucially, none of this requires drilling a single hole or removing a single stone. The pyramid stands exactly as it has stood. What changes is how much of its interior is visible to science. The Great Pyramid is not a sealed black box anymore. It's a structure that can be read from the outside, layer by layer, with tools that didn't exist 20 years ago. And those tools are already telling us that what we thought we knew about the interior is almost certainly incomplete. All of those methods, the muon detectors, the radar pulses, the ultrasonic sweeps, the resistivity arrays, converged on a single location. And what they found there, confirmed in a 2025 paper in Scientific Reports, is a space inside the Great Pyramid that nobody knew existed until recently, whose function remains genuinely unknown, and whose discovery rewrites the known floor plan of the most studied building on Earth. It is called the Scan Pyramid's North Face Corridor, SPNFC in the literature, and understanding what it is and what it isn't requires knowing exactly where to look. The north face of the Great Pyramid is not a smooth surface. Near its upper portion, you can see something called the chevron structure, a series of large limestone blocks arranged in an inverted V pattern, like a shallow pointed arch built directly into the face of the pyramid. Egyptologists have known about the chevron for a long time. Its function was assumed to be structural, a stress-relieving arrangement that distributes the load of the masonry above it and protects whatever lies behind from the crushing weight of millions of tons of stone. That interpretation still holds. What nobody had confirmed until now is what actually sits behind those blocks. The initial signal came from muon tomography. In work published in 2023 in Nature Communications, the Scan Pyramids team reported a corridor-shaped anomaly sitting directly behind the chevron, an elongated void at least 5 meters in length, oriented roughly horizontally, detectable because more muons were passing through that zone than through the surrounding limestone. The muon data established that something was there. But muon tomography, as powerful as it is, works slowly and at limited resolution. It could not answer how big the corridor was, how far it extended, or what its cross-section looked like. It could only confirm the presence of something that wasn't solid stone. That's what triggered the follow-up surveys. Teams placed ground-penetrating radar antennas directly against the stone surface in the area of blocks 3 and 4 of the chevron, running systematic grids with measurement spacings as tight as 50 millimeters. The radar results showed a clear reflective boundary beginning approximately 1 meter beneath the surface, a sharp contrast between limestone and air. Ultrasonic testing confirmed it from a different direction, producing reflection patterns consistent with an air-filled void at the same depth. Electrical resistivity tomography delivered the decisive detail. The material behind the chevron registered resistivity values greater than 1 megaohm meter. That number is not ambiguous. It is the resistivity signature of air, not stone, not sand, not any filling material. When all three surface-based datasets were merged through image fusion alongside the muon data, the same features appeared at the same positions across all four independent measurements. The corridor is approximately 2.5 meters wide, roughly 2.5 meters tall, and extends at least 9 meters inward from the face. It starts about 1 meter below the stone surface and runs back into the pyramid from there. Here is why the conformation matters. For decades, the Great Pyramid's interior has been the subject of endless speculation, partly because legitimate archaeological debate and outright conspiracy theories share the same vocabulary of hidden spaces and unknown voids. Every claim of an anomaly, every hint from an earlier radar survey or muon study, got absorbed into the same ecosystem of rumors about secret chambers, buried treasure, and encoded knowledge. The noise made it genuinely difficult to evaluate the signal. What the 2025 Scientific Reports paper does, and what makes multimodal image fusion such an important methodological step forward, is provide confirmation that meets a scientific standard. The corridor's existence doesn't rest on one instrument or one team's interpretation. It rests on four different physical phenomena, all responding the same way to the same empty space. That's not a hint, that's evidence. It also matters because it updates the known inventory of what's inside the pyramid. Before the Scan Pyramids project, the confirmed interior spaces were the subterranean chamber, the Queen's Chamber, the King's Chamber, the Grand Gallery, and a series of smaller passages connecting them. The big void detected in 2017 added to that list and remained unexplained. The North Face corridor adds to it again. The picture being assembled by these scans is of an interior that is more complex than the architectural drawings that have been in textbooks for over a century. But here is where certainty ends and interpretation begins. The purpose of the North Face corridor is not known. Nobody has been inside it. No inscription, no object, no direct observation informs the current discussion. What exists are theoretical frameworks, and the two most prominent ones are genuinely different from each other. The first is rooted in the work of architect Jean-Pierre Houdin, who spent years developing a model of the pyramid's construction that depends on a series of internal passages used to move materials during the building process. In his framework, the North Face corridor could be a component of what he called the Noble Circuit, an internal routing system connecting the King's Chamber complex to other parts of the structure. Under this interpretation, the corridor is a construction-related space, a remnant of the logistics infrastructure that made the pyramid possible, not a room with a ceremonial or funerary purpose. The second interpretation treats the corridor as an unfinished element, a space that was cut or formed during construction, and then simply left incomplete, sealed behind the chevron blocks, without serving the function originally intended. Under this reading, the corridor is evidence of a project that evolved as it was built, with plans changing and spaces being abandoned rather than completed. Neither interpretation is settled. Both rely on theoretical models rather than direct archaeological evidence. The dimensional estimates from the different scanning methods differ by up to half a meter depending on the technique used, because each has its own resolution limits, and each responds to slightly different physical properties of the same space. That variation doesn't undermine the confirmation. All four datasets agree there is a void, and they broadly agree on where it is. But it does mean that precise architectural claims about the corridor's geometry should be treated with appropriate caution. What the North Face corridor represents, stripped of both hype and dismissal, is exactly what good science produces, a confirmed finding that raises more questions than it answers, and a methodology capable of eventually answering them. The North Face Corridor is the newest name on a list that began growing 8 years earlier, when a different anomaly inside the same pyramid stopped the scientific world in its tracks. That one came first. That one drew bigger headlines. And that one, despite being confirmed by 3 independent technologies and published in one of the most respected journals in science, remains almost as mysterious today as the day it was announced. It is called the Big Void, and understanding what it actually is and what it is not requires sitting with a level of ambiguity that the internet has never been particularly comfortable with. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids team published findings in Nature that described a previously unknown space sitting directly above the Grand Gallery, the long, corbelled passage that climbs at a steep incline through the heart of the pyramid toward the King's Chamber. The team had deployed 3 different muon detection technologies simultaneously: nuclear emulsion films, scintillator hodoscopes, and gas detector telescopes. Each works by measuring the flux of cosmic ray muons passing through the pyramid from above. Where there is dense stone, fewer muons pass through. Where there is empty space, more muons pass through. The 3 independent detectors all registered the same surplus of muon flux in the same zone, above the Grand Gallery, with a consistency that ruled out instrumental error. There was something there, something large, something that had never been cataloged in any survey, any excavation report, any architectural record going back to the 19th century. The figures that emerged from the analysis drew immediate global attention, and for obvious reasons. The void has a minimum length of approximately 30 meters, roughly 98 feet. Its cross-section appears comparable in size to the Grand Gallery itself, one of the most impressive internal architectural spaces in the ancient world. If that comparison held, you were talking about a hidden corridor, or chamber of significant scale, sitting undisturbed and unexamined above one of the pyramid's most famous features. The last time a major internal space had been discovered in the Great Pyramid was in the 19th century. This was not a small anomaly in the margins. This was substantial. The world responded accordingly. Headlines described hidden chambers, secret rooms, spaces concealed for millennia. Speculation ran immediately to treasure, to scrolls, to artifacts, to whatever Khufu or those who built this structure might have sealed inside. Some corners of the internet did not wait even that long before connecting the void to older theories about the pyramid as an energy device, a repository of forbidden knowledge, a structure whose true purpose had been deliberately hidden from conventional archaeology. The Big Void arrived as a confirmed scientific fact and was almost immediately processed by public imagination into something else entirely. What the researchers actually said was considerably more restrained. They called it a void, not a chamber, not a room, not a hidden passage filled with anything. A void, meaning a space where stone is absent and something, likely air, is present. They were careful about the language because the language was doing real work. A void is a detected anomaly. A chamber is an interpretation of what that anomaly represents. Those two things are not the same, and collapsing the distance between them is precisely where confident public claims outrun the actual evidence. That distance has not closed in the years since the original announcement. Follow-up surveys, including the more precise 2023 work in Nature Communications that also identified the North Face Corridor, have continued mapping the pyramid's interior. What those surveys have confirmed is that the Big Void is real and substantial, but also that its exact geometry remains uncertain. Researchers cannot yet determine with confidence whether it is a single horizontal chamber, a single inclined space, or a series of adjoining voids stacked or angled in a way the current data cannot fully resolve. The muon tomography technique that confirmed its existence operates at a resolution that can establish size and rough position, but cannot produce the kind of detailed three-dimensional blueprint that would settle the architectural questions. The void is above the Grand Gallery. It is large. Beyond that, confident specifics become contested. This is the gap between what science has established and what the public tends to hear. Science established. There is a large empty space here that we did not know about, and we cannot yet determine its shape, its orientation, or its purpose. Public reception often translated that as, they found a secret chamber, and now they're covering up what's inside it. The leap from those two positions is not small, and the mechanism that produces the leap is worth examining directly. Anomaly detection is not the same as anomaly explanation. Every void inside the Great Pyramid was put there for a reason, but identifying that reason requires evidence beyond the existence of the void itself. The pyramid's known internal spaces include stress-relieving chambers above the king's chamber, passages that may have served construction logistics, and spaces whose original functions may have been revised as building plans evolved. The big void could be any of those things. It could be a series of construction chambers similar to the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. It could be an unfinished internal ramp system. It could be an architectural feature whose purpose had nothing to do with concealment. The point is that none of those possibilities requires hidden treasure, and none of them requires suppressed knowledge. They require evidence, which future high-resolution scanning or careful non-invasive probing may eventually provide. What the ongoing work of Scan Pyramids has demonstrated beyond any reasonable dispute is that the Great Pyramid's interior, after centuries of study, physical exploration, and increasingly sophisticated remote sensing, remains only partly understood. The known floor plan, the one printed in textbooks, rendered in museum diagrams, described in tour guides, is incomplete. There are spaces inside the structure that have not been entered, not been mapped with precision, not been explained. That is a genuinely remarkable fact about the most studied building in human history. But remarkable does not mean mysterious in the conspiratorial sense. It means the science is unfinished, which is the normal condition of science. The difference between a detected anomaly and a fully understood chamber is not a cover-up. It is the distance that careful research has yet to travel. So the pyramid's interior remains partly mapped, partly understood, with confirmed voids that science cannot yet fully explain. That uncertainty is real, and it matters. But there is a different kind of uncertainty that has surrounded the pyramids for far longer, one that has nothing to do with hidden chambers and everything to do with the people who built them. Who were they? How were they organized? What did their lives actually look like? For most of the modern era, the answer offered by popular culture was simple, confident, and wrong. They were slaves. Tens of thousands of them worked to death under the whip, building monuments for a god-king who cared nothing for their survival. That image is so embedded in the cultural furniture that questioning it can feel almost disorienting. But the archaeological record does not support it. And the reason we know that comes down to a single site about 400 meters south of the Sphinx. The site is called Hayt al-Ghurab, the Wall of the Crow, and archaeologists working there since the late 1980s have been excavating what is now recognized as the Giza Workers' Village. It is not famous in the way the pyramids are famous. It does not appear on most travel itineraries. It generates far fewer headlines than a newly confirmed corridor in a pharaoh's tomb. But in terms of what it reveals about ancient Egyptian society, it is arguably as significant as anything found at Giza, because it is not a monument. It is a workplace, a neighborhood, a community, and communities leave different kinds of evidence than monuments do. The settlement was active for roughly 35 years, spanning the construction campaigns of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, the three pharaohs responsible for the three main pyramids of Giza, ruling across a period roughly dated between 2613 and 2503 BCE. The layout is organized and deliberate in a way that speaks to centralized planning. There are three parallel streets. Purpose-built stone houses for overseers and senior administrators line one section of the site. Mud brick barracks accommodated laborers in communal arrangements that would have housed large numbers efficiently. There is an administrative office where rations and work teams were recorded. A bureaucratic infrastructure, in other words, not just a camp. There are bakeries capable of producing bread at industrial scale, breweries, copper workshops for maintaining and fabricating tools, storage magazines, and a hospital with evidence of medical treatment that goes beyond basic wound care. So the pyramid's interior remains partly mapped, partly understood, with confirmed voids that science cannot yet fully explain. That uncertainty is real, and it matters. But there is a different kind of uncertainty that has surrounded the pyramids for far longer, one that has nothing to do with hidden chambers and everything to do with the people who built them. Who were they? How were they organized? What did their lives actually look like? For most of the modern era, the answer offered by popular culture was simple, confident, and wrong. They were slaves. Tens of thousands of them worked to death under the whip, building monuments for a god king who cared nothing for their survival. That image is so embedded in the cultural furniture that questioning it can feel almost disorienting. But the archaeological record does not support it. And the reason we know that comes down to a single site about 400 meters south of the Sphinx. The site is called Hayt al-Ghurab, the Wall of the Crow, and archaeologists working there since the late 1980s have been excavating what is now recognized as the Giza Workers' Village. It is not famous in the way the pyramids are famous. It does not appear on most travel itineraries. It generates far fewer headlines than a newly confirmed corridor in a pharaoh's tomb. But in terms of what it reveals about ancient Egyptian society, it is arguably as significant as anything found at Giza, because it is not a monument, it is a workplace, a neighborhood, a community, and communities leave different kinds of evidence than monuments do. The settlement was active for roughly 35 years, spanning the construction campaigns of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, the three pharaohs responsible for the three main pyramids of Giza, ruling across a period roughly dated between 2613 and 2503 BCE. The layout is organized and deliberate in a way that speaks to centralized planning. There are three parallel streets. Purpose-built stone houses for overseers and senior administrators line one section of the site. Mud brick barracks accommodated laborers in communal arrangements that would have housed large numbers efficiently. There is an administrative office where rations and work teams were recorded. A bureaucratic infrastructure, in other words, not just a camp. There are bakeries capable of producing bread at industrial scale, breweries, copper workshops for maintaining and fabricating tools, storage magazines, and a hospital with evidence of medical treatment that goes beyond basic wound care. That last detail deserves emphasis. The skeletal remains from the workers' cemetery show healed fractures, bones broken during construction work and then allowed to recover, bones that knitted correctly, evidence that injured workers were not discarded but treated and returned to duty. There are cases of trepanation, the surgical removal of portions of skull bone that show healing around the edges, meaning the patients survived the procedure. The state was not simply extracting labor from these people, the state was investing in them, maintaining them, keeping them functional, and in some cases keeping them alive through what would have been, by any ancient standard, sophisticated medical intervention. The isotope evidence builds a remarkably precise picture of who these workers were and how they ate. Stable isotope analysis of dental collagen in bone material examining ratios of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium tells researchers where people grew up and what they consumed over the course of their lives. The results consistently show that the Giza workforce was drawn from the Nile Valley, people who were local in the broadest sense, not imported populations from distant regions. Their diet was high in protein, cattle, sheep and goats, fish, wheat and barley, not the diet of the exploited. The diet of a provisioned workforce fed at a standard that exceeded what most ordinary Egyptians of the same period would have eaten on a daily basis. One estimate, based on the animal bones recovered from the site, suggests that the butchering and preparation of meat was happening at a scale sufficient to feed thousands of people regularly. The workforce itself was not a single undifferentiated mass. Bioarchaeological estimates suggest up to 10,000 workers on site at any given time, but that number breaks down into distinct categories. There appears to have been a permanent core crew, skilled craftsmen, stonecutters, engineers, supervisors, who remained at Giza year-round and formed the institutional backbone of the construction operation. Around them cycled seasonal laborers who arrived for campaigns of roughly 3 to 5 months each year, contributed their labor during the construction season, and then returned to their home communities. This rotating model would have distributed the burden across a wide population while maintaining a skilled permanent center capable of the most technically demanding work. The DNA evidence from the cemetery adds another layer. Genetic analysis of multiple individuals buried at the site shows close familial relationships among those tested, kinship patterns that suggest family groups lived and worked together at Giza rather than being assembled from random individuals conscripted in isolation. This is not the picture of a slave gang. It is the picture of organized labor units with social cohesion, family bonds, and a degree of continuity across generations that implies people were coming back to this work year after year as a structured and recognized part of their lives. The cemetery itself reflects a hierarchy that maps onto the settlement's layout. Rank-and-file laborers were buried in simple mud brick pit graves, modest but intentional. Overseers and foremen were interred in larger mastaba-style tombs, some with hieroglyphic inscriptions naming their occupations, their titles, their roles in the construction program. Funerary goods, pottery, tools, objects associated with the next life were placed with the dead at multiple social levels. The state was not just feeding these people, it was burying them with the formalities that Egyptian culture reserved for people whose lives and deaths carried meaning. None of this is without qualification. The radiocarbon dates for some features of the village carry relatively wide confidence intervals, which means precise sequencing of when specific areas were in peak use and which pyramid's construction they directly supported remains a point of ongoing debate. The DNA sample is drawn from a limited number of burials and may not represent the full diversity of everyone who passed through the site across those 35 years. The picture the evidence provides is detailed and coherent, but it is not complete. What it is, definitively, is incompatible with the slave labor narrative that dominated popular imagination for generations. That narrative was never based on archaeological evidence. It was based on later texts, on Greek and Roman accounts written centuries after the pyramids were built, filtered through political assumptions about what large-scale ancient construction must have required. The evidence carved into the bones and stones of Het al-Ghurab tells a different story, of a workforce organized by the state, provisioned by the state, cared for by the state, and in some cases buried by the state with the dignity due to people who had done something that mattered. So how did we get the slave story in the first place? Because the archaeological evidence from Giza does not whisper ambiguity, it is fairly direct. And yet for most people alive today, the image of pyramid construction involves whips, chains, and columns of broken, exhausted human beings dragged across the desert under a merciless sun. That image did not emerge from the ground. It was written, then filmed, then repeated until it calcified into something that felt like obvious historical fact. The earliest written source is Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, roughly 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was built. He wrote that Cheops, which is the Greek version of Khufu's name, forced his subjects into oppressive labor, closing the temples and driving ordinary people into servitude to complete his monument. Herodotus was not an archaeologist. He was a traveler who gathered stories from local guides and interpreters, working at an enormous chronological remove from the events he described. His account of Egypt is vivid, entertaining, and frequently incorrect in ways we can now verify. He recorded what people told him, and what people told him in the 5th century BCE about events from the 26th century BCE was, at best, the accumulated mythology of 20 generations. Then came Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century CE, who took a further step. Josephus explicitly connected the pyramid builders to the Hebrew slaves described in the biblical book of Exodus, the Israelites laboring under Pharaoh's command before the events of Moses and the plagues and the flight from Egypt. The image clicked into place with extraordinary cultural force. Here was a story that already carried enormous moral and emotional weight, a founding narrative of suffering and liberation, now fused to the most visually iconic monuments in the ancient world. The pyramids became the backdrop to the Exodus, and the Exodus became the explanation for the pyramids. The problem is chronology, and it is not a minor one. The Great Pyramid was built during the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, approximately 2600 BCE. The Exodus narrative, to whatever extent it reflects a historical event, is placed by scholars in the New Kingdom during the Ramesside period of the 13th century BCE, roughly 1300 years later. The store cities that Exodus mentions explicitly, Pithom and Ramesses, were built from mud brick. The enslaved people in that text were making bricks without straw, not cutting and hauling limestone blocks across a plateau. The biblical text itself, read carefully, does not describe pyramid construction. It describes something entirely different in a different era, using different materials. The conflation was never historically coherent. It was emotionally coherent, which turned out to matter far more. That emotional coherence found its most powerful vehicle in the 20th century. Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 film, The Ten Commandments, did more to cement the slave pyramid image in global popular consciousness than any text written since antiquity. The film is visually staggering in its depictions of Hebrew slaves hauling massive blocks driven by Egyptian overseers. The pyramid silhouette looms in the background as shorthand for tyranny and oppression. Charlton Heston and the moral architecture of Hollywood's golden age fused ancient Egypt, the Exodus story, and the pyramid into a single mythological image that ran on television every Easter for decades across the Western world. Generations of people learned in the most immersive way that popular media can teach that pyramids meant slavery. It did not matter that the film was fiction. The image was too powerful and too emotionally satisfying to require a citation. That is not an accusation against DeMille or against audiences. Human beings understand history through stories, and the slave narrative offered a story with everything a story needs: clear villains, innocent victims, spectacular scale, and a moral lesson that resonates across cultures. What it sacrificed in exchange for that clarity was the actual complexity of what ancient Egyptian labor obligations looked like, because something did exist in ancient Egypt that deserves honest examination rather than romantic simplification in either direction. The system scholars most often associate with large-scale state projects is corvée labor, a form of obligatory service in which adult men were conscripted by the state for defined periods to work on royal projects, after which they returned to their communities. This is not the same as chattel slavery, the system of permanent, heritable, bought and sold human ownership that the word slavery most commonly evokes in modern usage. Corvée labor was coercive, it was state-imposed, and it was not freely chosen. The Mera papyri, administrative logs dating to around 2600 BCE, the oldest papyri ever discovered, found at the site of Wadi el-Jarf, record boat crews transporting limestone from Tura to Giza, with entries detailing supplies, schedules, and officials managing the operation with bureaucratic precision. These are not records of a slave system. They are records of organized state labor, managed, provisioned, and administered. The human beings in those records had names, they had ranks, their rations were tracked. What gets lost when we replace all of that with the slave spectacle is not just historical accuracy. It is the real texture of what these people's lives involved, the seasonal disruption of being called away from farming, the physical danger of quarrying and hauling stone over years of construction campaigns, the hierarchical pressures of working within a vast state apparatus that had enormous power over individual lives. Those are forms of hardship that deserve acknowledgement. They are not the same as the Hollywood image of the whipped, anonymous slave, but they are not a story of pure voluntary enthusiasm either. The truth sits in a more complicated place, and it involves real human cost that is poorly served by both the dramatic slave narrative and by any temptation to overcorrect into the opposite extreme. The archaeological evidence at Giza tells us who these people were. The textual evidence in the papyri tells us how their labor was organized. What neither supports is the image that Herodotus sketched, that Josephus elaborated, and that Cecil B. DeMille turned into a cinematic monument as durable in its own way as the pyramids themselves. That image endured not because the evidence supported it, but because the story it told was one that people already wanted to believe. And that, as it turns out, is a phenomenon that extends well beyond the question of who built the pyramids. So we have established who built the pyramids. The next question that tends to follow immediately, and that tends to generate its own wave of skepticism, is how. And here is where the conversation often splits in a revealing way. On one side, you have people who look at the scale of the Great Pyramid, 2.3 million stone blocks, many weighing between 2 and 15 tons, assembled to a height of nearly 500 feet over roughly 20 years, and conclude that the engineering challenge is simply too large for any explanation that doesn't involve lost super technology or outside intervention. On the other side, you have experimental archaeologists, engineers, and physicists who have spent decades testing very specific hypotheses with real materials in real conditions, and arriving at results that are, if you pay attention to them, genuinely astonishing in a different way. The honest version of the story starts with separating the problem into its actual components, because treating the construction of the Great Pyramid as a single monolithic mystery obscures the fact that it was actually a series of distinct logistical challenges, each of which has been studied separately and each of which has yielded real experimental data. Quarrying the stone, transporting it from the quarry to the site, and then raising it into position are three different problems requiring three different solutions. Conflating them into one giant unsolvable question is part of how the mystery gets inflated beyond what the evidence actually supports. Start at the quarry. Most of the Great Pyramid's core limestone came from a quarry immediately south of the Giza Plateau itself, which meant the transport distance for the bulk of the material was relatively short. The harder granite used for internal chambers and relieving structures came from Aswan, roughly 500 miles to the south, and was almost certainly floated north on the Nile during the annual inundation when the floodwaters brought boats close to the plateau's edge. Quarrying limestone was accomplished with copper chisels, copper saws, and wooden wedges. Harder granite required a different approach. Teams of workers using rounded dolerite balls, essentially rocks used as hammers, to pound and pound along natural fault lines in the stone until blocks could be separated. Water-filled wooden pegs were driven into cracks, and as the wood expanded, the stone split. It was labor-intensive and time-consuming, but it worked, and we know it worked because the tools exist, the quarry marks exist, and unfinished obelisks in various stages of extraction still sit in the Aswan quarry today, frozen in the middle of the process as though the workers simply set down their tools and walked away. Transport is where some of the most striking experimental results have appeared. The image of workers hauling massive stone blocks across sand has always attracted skepticism. The friction alone seems prohibitive, but a 2014 study from the University of Amsterdam, published in Physical Review Letters, reproduced a scene from the ancient Egyptian tomb of Jehuta-hotep, which shows workers pouring liquid in front of a sledge carrying an enormous statue. The experiment confirmed that wetting sand to the right level creates what physicists call capillary bridges between sand grains, microscopic water connections that firm the surface and prevent the sand from piling up in front of the sled. The result is a dramatic reduction in friction. The pulling force required drops by roughly half. For a 2-ton block that previously needed around 16 workers to drag across dry sand, wet sand brought that number down to approximately 8. For a 16-ton block, the reduction was proportionally similar, cutting the required crew from around 45 workers to something closer to half that number. The Egyptians did not discover this by accident. Someone noticed, someone applied it systematically, and the tomb painting that we have interpreted as ceremonial decoration turns out to be a fairly accurate technical diagram. Field experiments have reinforced this picture from a different angle. A well-documented reconstruction during the 1990s demonstrated that a 2.5-ton concrete block could be dragged up a slope of roughly 1 in 4 by a team of 18 men, moving at about 1 foot per second. That is not moving fast. But fast is not the goal when your project timeline is measured in years. Consistent, manageable, repeated effort over a sustained period is the goal, and the experimental evidence suggests that the logistics were well within the reach of organized human crews using simple but effective technology. What makes all of this feasible at the scale of the Great Pyramid is the labor force itself, and this is where the numbers become worth sitting with. Scholarly estimates based on the archaeological record at Giza, the workers' village, the administrative records, the logistical infrastructure visible in the material remains, place the total construction workforce somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people. That number includes not just the workers dragging blocks, but the bakers, brewers, administrators, physicians, toolmakers, and logistical supervisors required to keep a city-scale operation running. When researchers have modeled the construction schedule with those workforce numbers against the total volume of stone to be placed, a 20 to 23-year timeline becomes plausible. Not comfortable, not easy, but plausible. For context, medieval European cathedrals sometimes took over a century to complete. The Great Pyramid was more efficiently executed than stone monuments built in societies we never question as historically real. This is actually the most important reframe available when thinking about how the pyramids were built. The question is not whether ancient Egyptians could have done this with the tools and techniques they had. The experimental and archaeological evidence strongly suggests they could. The more interesting question is what it tells us about the organizational sophistication of the 4th Dynasty state that they pulled it off, coordinating 20 to 30,000 workers across multiple specialized roles, quarrying teams, transport crews, stone-setting gangs, supply chains stretching to the Sinai for copper and to Aswan for granite, required administrative capacity and project management skill that would be impressive in any era. The papyri that have survived confirm exactly that kind of record-keeping existed, down to the daily rations issued to individual work crews. There is a temptation, when the practical mechanisms become clear, to feel like something has been taken away, that explaining the how somehow diminishes the achievement. But it does the opposite. A monument built by 50,000 supernatural beings following plans from another civilization is just a tourist attraction. A monument built by 25,000 human beings using copper tools, wet sand, coordinated sledges, organized labor, and decades of sustained collective effort is something far more remarkable. It is evidence of what people can actually do, which brings us to the part of the construction question that has generated the most sustained argument among engineers, archaeologists, and architectural historians, and the part that remains even now genuinely unresolved. Getting stone to the site is one challenge. Getting it off the ground and into position, layer by layer for nearly 500 feet of finished height, is a different problem entirely. And on this question, the honest answer is that we do not have a single confirmed solution. What we have is a set of competing models, each with real evidence behind it, each with real problems, and a research landscape that is still actively producing new data. Start with the simplest proposal, the one that tends to get introduced first in textbook treatments and dismissed almost as quickly: a straight external ramp built from ground level up to the working face of the pyramid, growing longer and taller as the structure rises. In principle, this would work. Ramps are not exotic technology, but the geometry becomes catastrophic once you work through the numbers. To maintain the kind of grade that workers and sledges could actually negotiate, something around 8 to 10%, a ramp reaching the upper courses of the pyramid would need to extend for more than a mile. The volume of material required to build and maintain that ramp would approach or exceed the volume of the pyramid itself. You would essentially be constructing two pyramids, dismantling one, and hoping the debris disposal didn't create its own logistical nightmare. No remnant of a ramp structure at that scale has ever been found on the Giza Plateau. The straight ramp, as a complete explanation for the full height of the construction, does not survive engineering scrutiny. Zigzag and spiral external ramps solve the length problem but trade it for different ones. If you run a ramp back and forth across the pyramid's faces and switchbacks, or spiral it around the outside, you reduce the total run required, but at every turn you have a fundamental geometric problem. Blocks being dragged around corners at steep angles, with the turning radius constrained by the pyramid's own face. You also lose sight of the pyramid's corners during the build, which matters considerably when the finished structure needs to be as geometrically precise as the Great Pyramid actually is. Maintaining accurate alignment while the corners are buried under ramp material is a surveying problem that compounds with every course added. External spiral ramps have attracted serious attention, but the corner angle difficulty and the absence of physical evidence keep them contested. Jean-Pierre Houdin's internal ramp hypothesis, developed in the early 2000s with input from structural engineers and 3D modeling software, proposes something more architecturally elegant. The idea is a hybrid system, an external ramp used for the lower third of the pyramid, where the geometry is manageable and the material volume is not yet prohibitive, followed by an internal spiral ramp that winds upward through the body of the structure as construction progresses. The internal ramp in Houdin's model is roughly 6 meters wide, running at a grade of around 7%, with L-shaped turning rooms at the pyramid's corners where workers could rotate blocks and change direction. The evidence he points to includes a visible notch on the pyramid's northeast corner, which Houdin interprets as one of those turning rooms, now partially open. Microgravimetric surveys conducted by EDF in 1986 also suggested anomalous density variations inside the pyramid consistent with the spiral passage his model predicts. The internal ramp idea has not been confirmed, but it has not been ruled out either. It has the virtue of being geometrically feasible, logistically coherent, and consistent with several features of the pyramid that are otherwise unexplained. The corner notch is real, the density variations are real. Whether they add up to Houdin's specific model is the open question. What has been added to this debate most recently is a 2025 study published in NPJ Heritage Science, which introduced what the researchers called an integrated edge ramp system, essentially temporary open-air construction lanes cut into the pyramid's own edges, running up the face of the structure rather than attached externally. The model was built around careful computational logistics, testing whether the block flow rates required to finish the pyramid within Khufu's reign were achievable. The answer was yes. The simulation showed that with 4-minute intervals between block deliveries and a workforce organized around that rhythm, the Great Pyramid could be completed in somewhere between 14 and 21 years on site, with the full project including quarrying and transport running 20 to 27 years. That range sits comfortably within what the historical record supports. The friction data underlying those numbers comes from the same experimental archaeology covered in the previous section. Wet sand reducing the coefficient of friction to around 0.20, with a crew of roughly 23 to 32 workers able to haul a 2.5-ton block up a 7-degree slope in a matter of minutes. The construction timeline becomes plausible precisely because the individual movements, when you model them carefully, are not heroic feats. They are repetitive, manageable, organized work. And then there is the North Face corridor, confirmed in 2025 through the multi-sensor imaging work published in Scientific Reports, approximately 5 to 9 meters long, roughly 2 by 2 meters in cross-section, sitting behind the chevron blocks on the pyramid's north face. Its function is still under debate. Some researchers see it as consistent with the predicted path of an edge ramp or internal ramp system. Others interpret it as a relieving structure or unfinished chamber. That question cannot be settled without further investigation. But the corridor's geometry fits naturally into the practical vocabulary of construction management, and its existence suggests, once again, that the interior of the pyramid contains structural logic we are only beginning to read. What the full spread of ramp theories demonstrates is not confusion or impossibility. It is a live engineering conversation grounded in physical evidence. Specialists disagree about method because construction left limited direct traces, and multiple models can satisfy the available constraints. That ambiguity is not a gap waiting to be filled by the supernatural. It is what incomplete evidence looks like when serious people are doing serious work on it. The debate over how the blocks were raised does not suggest the pyramid could not have been built by human hands. It suggests we have not yet identified the precise method among several that would have worked, and that distinction matters enormously. Set aside, for a moment, the question of how the stones were raised, and consider a different problem. Not vertical, but horizontal. Before the first block was laid, before the ramp debate had any meaning at all, someone had to draw a square on the ground, a square nearly 230 meters on each side, sitting on a platform of leveled bedrock, oriented to the 4 cardinal directions with a precision that should, when you actually measure it, stop you cold. The Great Pyramid's sides deviate from true north by less than 3 arc minutes. That is less than 1/20th of a single degree. To give that figure some context, the tolerance on most modern surveying work for large civil engineering projects runs to roughly the same range. The Great Pyramid, built more than 4,500 years ago using no magnetized compass, no GPS, no electronic theodolite, achieves an alignment that rivals what contemporary professionals consider acceptable for infrastructure construction. Every serious survey of the structure has confirmed this. The reported deviation shifts slightly between measurement campaigns. Some find 0.04 degrees, some find 0.06, but every one of them agrees on the essential finding, which is sub-zero, 1 degree precision, achieved in a single construction event, without the feedback systems modern engineers rely on. The natural response, and the one that conspiracy content reaches for immediately, is to treat that precision as evidence of something beyond ordinary human capability. But that response makes a specific and largely unexamined assumption that ancient people, working without modern instruments, were essentially guessing. They were not. What they had, instead of precision instruments, was time, patience, and something modern engineers rarely think about as a resource: the night sky. The model that has attracted the most rigorous attention from archaeoastronomers is the one developed by Kate Spence, which centers on 2 circumpolar stars, Mizar in the handle of what we call the Big Dipper, and Kochab in the bowl of the Little Dipper. Circumpolar stars never set from the latitude of Giza. They wheel continuously around the celestial pole, and from any fixed observation point on the ground, the pole itself marks true north. The problem is that the pole is not occupied by a bright star. It has to be found indirectly by watching the motion of stars around it. What Spence's model proposes is that Egyptian priest astronomers observed the moment when Mizar and Kochab appeared vertically aligned, one directly above the other, and used that line to sight north. At that specific moment of vertical alignment, the 2 stars straddle the pole, and the line connecting them passes through the true north point on the horizon. That technique works. It produces accurate results. And Spence's model contains a built-in consistency check that makes it particularly compelling. The optimum moment for the Mizar-Kochab alignment, when the 2 stars were closest to an exact vertical through the pole, occurred around 2467 BC, a date that falls squarely within the accepted construction window for the Great Pyramid. More than that, the gradual drift of that alignment over centuries, as precession slowly shifts the positions of all stars relative to the pole, predicts a pattern in which earlier pyramids would be slightly less accurately aligned. The alignment would reach a peak of precision, and then later pyramids would show increasing error in the opposite direction. That is exactly what the archaeological record shows when you measure the orientations of successive Old Kingdom pyramids in sequence. The pyramids effectively function as a record of the star alignment method's accuracy over time, and they match the prediction. There is also a second proposed method, entirely independent of stars. A vertical rod planted in the ground, a gnomon, casts shadows throughout the day. On the fall equinox, when the sun rises due east and sets due west, the shadow traced by that rod across the ground defines the east-west axis directly. Experiments replicating this method have reproduced the Great Pyramid's error margin. A vertical stick and careful observation on a single autumn day can achieve sub-degree cardinal alignment. The shadow method requires no knowledge of astronomy beyond recognizing the equinox, no instruments beyond the rod and a flat surface. Neither method has been confirmed by a contemporary Egyptian text that says, explicitly, this is what we did. That absence is worth stating clearly. The Mizar-Kochab hypothesis and the equinox gnomon are best fit explanations, supported by experimental reproduction and by the internal coherence of the archaeological record, but they are not proven procedures in the documentary sense. What they are is the most parsimonious explanation available, the one that requires no extraordinary additional assumptions, fits the known evidence, and can be demonstrated to work. The key point, and the one that tends to get lost in discussions that reach immediately for the extraordinary, is this. Precision does not require complexity of instruments, it requires repetition. Both the star alignment method and the shadow method improve dramatically when observations are made on multiple nights or across several days, and the results are averaged. Random errors, a slight gust of wind shifting the sightline, a momentary misread of shadow position, cancel out when you take enough measurements. Ancient priest astronomers who conducted the same observation 10 nights running were not using primitive methods. They were using a statistically sound approach to reducing error that is still the foundation of careful measurement today. And this is where the alignment connects to something beyond pure engineering. The orientation of the pyramid was not simply a practical problem. In Old Kingdom Egypt, cardinal alignment was inseparable from religious and political meaning. North was the direction of the imperishable stars, the circumpolar stars that never died by setting below the horizon. Aligning the pyramid's north face precisely with that direction was a statement about the king's eternal nature, his identification with the undying stars, his position within a cosmological order that state ritual constantly reinforced. The astronomical precision and the religious purpose were the same act. The people who cited those star alignments were not anonymous surveyors. They were almost certainly priest astronomers whose role combined technical observation with ritual authority. High precision in ancient architecture is not a fingerprint of supernatural intervention. It is a fingerprint of organized, motivated, skilled human effort applied patiently over time, which is, when you look at the evidence clearly, a more remarkable thing. So the pyramid points north with extraordinary precision, and it does so, as we've just seen, through methods that are technically demanding but entirely within the reach of organized, observant human effort. That finding raises a follow-up question that a large part of the popular discourse around Giza has staked significant territory on. What if the orientation wasn't primarily about north at all? What if the whole layout, 3 pyramids, 3 shafts, 3 of everything, was designed to mirror something else in the sky? Specifically, the 3 stars of Orion's belt. This is the Orion correlation theory, popularized by Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert in their 1994 book The Orion Mystery, and it remains one of the most widely repeated claims in the ancient mystery genre. It is worth taking seriously. which means it is worth examining carefully. Not to dismiss Egyptian astronomical knowledge, which was genuine, sophisticated, and demonstrably important to the culture, but to look at what the evidence for the correlation actually requires before it can hold. The claim in its most compelling form goes like this. The three main pyramids at Giza, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, are not arranged in a straight line. Khufu and Khafre are roughly aligned, but Menkaure sits slightly offset to the southwest. Orion's belt, the three stars Al-Nitak, Al-Nilam, and Mintaka, shows a similar configuration, two stars roughly aligned, the third slightly offset. The implication drawn is that the pyramid builders deliberately laid out the Giza complex as a ground map of that constellation, encoding astronomical meaning into the very footprint of the site. The Nile, running alongside, was cast as the Milky Way. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid point toward significant stars. The whole plateau was, on this reading, a celestial diagram frozen in stone. There is genuine astronomical awareness embedded in Egyptian culture, and that point needs to be stated plainly. The Egyptians tracked star transits to establish their calendar. Certain pyramid shafts do align with specific stars at specific historical dates. The concept of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, was cosmologically linked to particular star groupings, and Orion was centrally important to that mythology. None of that is in dispute, and acknowledging it is not the same as accepting the Orion correlation as a precise architectural blueprint. The problem is in the specifics of what the correlation actually requires. Bauval's alignment works, to the extent that it works at all, only after you rotate the star map approximately 15.3 degrees anti-clockwise and reverse the orientation north to south. That is not a minor adjustment. It is a substantial manipulation of the image before the comparison is made. The pyramid's axis runs roughly 38 degrees from true north. Orion's belt runs at roughly 53 degrees to the celestial equator. To overlay one on the other requires that 15-degree correction. If you lay the unconverted star map over the pyramid plan, the match disappears. Then there is the question of how close the match actually is even after that rotation. The positional offset between the Khufu pyramid and its corresponding star Al-Nitak is approximately 2.5 arc minutes. Proponents argue that falls within the naked eye resolution limit, and that is technically true. The human eye cannot distinguish angular separations below roughly 5 to 10 arc minutes without optical aid. But notice what that argument is actually doing. It is not claiming the match is precise. It is claiming the match is close enough that we cannot see its imprecision with the naked eye. That is not evidence of deliberate alignment. That is evidence that the discrepancy is small enough to be invisible without instruments, which is a very different thing from accuracy. And here is the detail that tends to stay quiet in popular presentations of the theory. Other star patterns fit the Giza layout with equal or better visual correspondence once the same degree of rotation and rescaling is permitted. The short arm of the constellation Cygnus, for instance, can be overlaid with a comparable visual fit. The fact that multiple different asterisms match under flexible conditions is not evidence that any one of them was intended. It is evidence that the matching process is unconstrained enough to find coincidences almost anywhere. This is pattern recognition doing what human cognition does naturally and continuously. The brain is extraordinarily good at finding resemblances in partial information. It is what allowed early humans to identify predators in dappled shadow, to read emotional states in subtle facial movements, to detect meaningful signals in complex environments. That capability is not a flaw. It is one of the most powerful features of human perception, but it becomes a liability when we mistake the pattern finding itself for evidence that the pattern was placed there deliberately. Psychologists sometimes call the broader phenomenon apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. The Orion correlation in its popular form is a clean example, a modest spatial coincidence amplified by selective rotation and framing, presented as a grand celestial blueprint. Contrast that with what we established in the previous section. The Great Pyramid's cardinal alignment deviates from true north by less than 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a degree. That precision is consistent across multiple independent surveys. It is reproducible by experimental methods that require only circumpolar star observation or equinox shadow tracking. It aligns with a pattern of increasing and then decreasing accuracy across successive Old Kingdom pyramids that tracks precisely with what the Mazar-Kochab precession model predicts. The evidence for deliberate engineered precision in the cardinal alignment is specific, testable, and internally consistent. The Orion correlation requires manipulation of the data before the comparison is made, still produces an approximate rather than exact match, and cannot distinguish itself from other accidental pattern fits under the same conditions. That is the difference between evocative symbolism and strong evidence. The Orion story is evocative. It touches real things, real Egyptian reverence for the constellation, real astronomical sophistication in the culture, real geometric relationships on the plateau. Those elements give it traction, but traction is not the same as accuracy. The claim that the Giza complex was laid out as a deliberate mirror of Orion's belt does not survive the specific question of what adjustments were required to make it look that way, and why no other explanation for those adjustments has been proposed that doesn't involve working backward from the desired conclusion. Egyptian astronomy mattered enormously to the people who built these structures. The stars were not decoration. They were cosmology, calendar, theology, and royal legitimacy simultaneously. That genuine sophistication deserves more rigorous engagement than a pattern match that only holds after a 15-degree rotation, because the real story of how those builders understood the sky is considerably more interesting than a coincidence dressed up as a blueprint. The Orion correlation is a story built from selective pattern matching and a 15-degree rotation that its proponents rarely advertise. But that is, in a sense, one of the more disciplined entries in the genre. Once you move beyond the astronomical claims, the landscape of popular pyramid mythology expands considerably, and the logical moves become less careful, not more. There are 3 major clusters of conspiracy narrative that dominate contemporary pyramid discourse, and they are worth mapping clearly before evaluating them. The first holds that the pyramids were built by extraterrestrials, or by a vanished advanced civilization, Atlanteans, pre-cataclysmic societies, a Lemurian race, who possessed technology that the ancient Egyptians simply could not have developed on their own. The second holds that the Great Pyramid is not a tomb at all, but a functioning machine, specifically a power plant that generated microwave energy or hydrogen through a complex internal system of acoustic resonators, chemical reactions, and piezoelectric quartz cavities. The third holds that the pyramid generates healing or mystical energy, that its shape alone preserves organic matter, sharpens metal blades, affects human consciousness, and concentrates paranormal force. These 3 claims are distinct, and they sometimes contradict each other. Proponents of the power plant theory do not always embrace the alien builder model. Advocates for healing energy do not necessarily endorse the hydrogen generator hypothesis, but they share a common argumentative skeleton, and that skeleton is worth recognizing because it appears consistently across all 3. The move begins with genuine wonder. The pyramid is large, precise, and ancient. How did people working without modern machinery quarry, transport, and place millions of multi-ton limestone blocks with such consistency? That question is real and worth asking. Experimental archaeology has provided detailed, testable answers. Wet sand lubricated sledges, coordinated teams of 20 to 30,000 workers, logistics documented in the Wadi al-Jarf papyri, which record actual quarry transport schedules from around 2562 BC. The workers were not slaves. They were a state-organized, kin-based labor force housed in a purpose-built village at Hayt el-Ghurab, well-fed and medically attended, as both DNA evidence and isotope analysis of their remains confirm. But the conspiracy narrative does not incorporate those answers. Instead, it treats the question itself. the apparent difficulty as evidence that the question has no conventional answer. If you cannot immediately picture how it was done, the argument goes, then it couldn't have been done by ordinary human effort. This is the argument from incredulity, and it is worth naming it precisely because it is the load-bearing structure under nearly every major pyramid conspiracy claim. The gap between "I cannot imagine how" and "therefore it wasn't done this way" is enormous. That gap is filled not with evidence but with the emotional weight of the original astonishment. The power plant claim, most fully developed by Christopher Dunn in his 1998 book The Giza Power Plant, is perhaps the most technically elaborate of the three, and therefore the most instructive to examine. Dunn's model assigns specific functions to each internal space: the Queen's Chamber as a hydrogen generator, the Grand Gallery as an array of acoustic resonators, the King's Chamber as a piezoelectric cavity exploiting the quartz content of the granite walls, and the shafts as microwave waveguides directing energy outward. The theory invokes real physical phenomena. Piezoelectricity is real, acoustic resonance is real, quartz does produce microscale electrical charge under pressure. The problem is not that these phenomena don't exist. The problem is the magnitude. Quartz crystals under mechanical stress generate outputs in the microvolt range. Industrial power generation requires outputs many millions of times larger. Stretching a real physical effect by that factor without any supporting measurements is not applied physics. It is the vocabulary of physics arranged to sound like physics, and the material record offers no support whatsoever. The Giza workers' village contains tools, administrative records, medical debris, and food remains. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri describe stone transport in practical, logistical language. There are no references to power output, no remnants of electrical components, no contemporaneous texts describing energy systems. The power plant claim treats that absence not as a falsifying gap but as evidence of suppression. The records were hidden, destroyed, or never made in the first place because the knowledge was too dangerous or too foreign to the civilization's official self-understanding. That interpretive move, converting the absence of evidence into confirmation of a cover-up, is a closed loop. No archaeological finding can challenge a theory that defines all contrary evidence as part of the conspiracy. The healing energy claims operate similarly, though with softer physics. The proposition that pyramid-shaped containers preserve food, sharpen razor blades, or produce measurable biological effects was tested in limited experimental settings in the 1970s. No statistically significant effects were found. Proponents responded that the methodology was flawed. That response is not inherently unreasonable. Methodology can always be questioned, but when every negative test result is attributed to experimental error and every positive anecdote is treated as confirmation, the claim has effectively made itself immune to testing. A claim that cannot be falsified is not a scientific hypothesis. It is a belief system wearing the costume of one. What archaeology actually supports is this. The Great Pyramid was designed and built by a sophisticated, organized, hierarchically structured human society over a period of roughly 20 years. The precision of its construction reflects mastery of practical geometry, supply chain logistics, labor management, and long-term planning at a scale that was, for its time, genuinely extraordinary. The newly confirmed North Face corridor, imaged in 2025 by multimodal muon tomography and image fusion, and the still debated Big Void detected by scanned pyramids do represent genuine unknowns. Scholars continue to debate whether those spaces served construction, ventilation, or ceremonial purposes. That uncertainty is real. But real uncertainty is not the same as a blank check for any explanation that finds the spaces convenient. The gap between "we don't yet know what this corridor was for and therefore it housed a hydrogen reactor" is not bridged by imagination. It is bridged by evidence, by material traces, by physical consistency, by testability. The conspiracy narratives examined here consistently mistake one for the other, and that substitution is not a minor logical slip. It is the entire mechanism by which genuine wonder gets converted into claims that the archaeological record does not and cannot support. So if the logical flaws in these narratives are this visible, if the argument from incredulity is this identifiable, if the power plant physics are this straightforwardly wrong, if the Orion rotation is this clearly advertised in the fine print and ignored in the headline, then the obvious question is why these stories keep spreading. Why do they not simply collapse under the weight of their own contradictions? The answer is not that the people who believe them are foolish. The answer is structural, and it operates on several levels simultaneously. The healing energy claims operate similarly, though with softer physics. The proposition that pyramid-shaped containers preserve food, sharpen razor blades, or produce measurable biological effects was tested in limited experimental settings in the 1970s. No statistically significant effects were found. Proponents responded that the methodology was flawed. That response is not inherently unreasonable. Methodology can always be questioned, but when every negative test result is attributed to experimental error and every positive anecdote is treated as confirmation, the claim has effectively made itself immune to testing. A claim that cannot be falsified is not a scientific hypothesis. It is a belief system wearing the costume of one. What archaeology actually supports is this. The Great Pyramid was designed and built by a sophisticated, organized, hierarchically structured human society over a period of roughly 20 years. The precision of its construction reflects mastery of practical geometry, supply chain logistics, labor management, and long-term planning at a scale that was, for its time, genuinely extraordinary. The newly confirmed North Face corridor, imaged in 2025 by multimodal muon tomography and image fusion, and the still debated big void detected by scan pyramids do represent genuine unknowns. Scholars continue to debate whether those spaces served construction, ventilation, or ceremonial purposes. That uncertainty is real. But real uncertainty is not the same as a blank check for any explanation that finds the spaces convenient. The gap between "we don't yet know what this corridor was for" and "therefore it housed a hydrogen reactor" is not bridged by imagination. It is bridged by evidence, by material traces, by physical consistency, by testability. The conspiracy narratives examined here consistently mistake one for the other, and that substitution is not a minor logical slip. It is the entire mechanism by which genuine wonder gets converted into claims that the archaeological record does not and cannot support. So if the logical flaws in these narratives are this visible, if the argument from incredulity is this identifiable, if the power plant physics are this straightforwardly wrong, if the Orion rotation is this clearly advertised in the fine print and ignored in the headline, then the obvious question is why these stories keep spreading. Why do they not simply collapse under the weight of their own contradictions? The answer is not that the people who believe them are foolish. The answer is structural, and it operates on several levels simultaneously. Visual media has its own structural bias independent of any algorithm. A documentary that spends 8 minutes presenting muon tomography data, explaining the image fusion methodology behind the North Face corridor confirmation, and carefully distinguishing between what the 2025 Scientific Reports paper established and what it left open, that documentary is doing honest work. It is also competing for the same viewer against a video that opens with dramatic orchestral music, shows a slow drone shot over Giza at sunset, and within 90 seconds delivers the sentence, "What they found inside is something they were never supposed to find." The second video is not more accurate, it is more cinematic, and on a platform where the thumbnail and the first 30 seconds determine whether a viewer stays, cinema wins. Visual spectacle rewards certainty and punishes nuance. Hedge a claim and you sound evasive. State it flatly and you sound authoritative. The incentive gradient runs directly away from the kind of qualified, evidence-based communication that archaeology actually produces. Underneath all of this runs a deeper current, and it would be dishonest not to acknowledge it directly. A meaningful portion of the pyramid conspiracy audience does not arrive confused about the evidence. They arrive already skeptical of the institutions that produce the evidence. Egyptologists are framed consistently and deliberately as gatekeepers, as a credentialed class with careers built on a narrative they cannot afford to revise. Heritage officials, governments, and museums are cast as co-conspirators in an active suppression campaign. That framing resonates because institutional trust has eroded broadly, and not always without reason. People have been misled by experts. Scientific consensus has sometimes lagged behind evidence. Credentials have sometimes been used to shut down legitimate inquiry. Those real grievances, however, do not validate the specific claim that Egyptologists are hiding proof of alien construction. They simply create the emotional context in which such a claim feels plausible, in which distrust of the messenger becomes a reason to reject the message regardless of what it contains. That is the final and perhaps most important structural element, and it points directly to why simple debunking is not enough. A correction that only dismantles a false claim leaves a space where the false claim used to be. If nothing fills that space, nothing as compelling, as visually rich, as emotionally satisfying, the original claim often flows back in. Research on what some call inoculation theory suggests that audiences become more resistant to misinformation, not when they are simply told what is wrong, but when they are given something true that is told with equal energy and equal care. The real history of the Great Pyramid is not a dry administrative record. It is a story about tens of thousands of people organized across generations, fed and housed by a state infrastructure, working with practical genius under conditions that demanded coordination of a kind the ancient world had never attempted at that scale. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri are actual administrative logs written by actual people managing actual stone. The Hayt el-Ghurab workers' village contains the bones of people who built something that is still standing. That is not a lesser story than the alien hypothesis. It is a far more interesting one. It simply requires the same commitment to telling it well, which means the question is not only what is true about the pyramids. The question is whether we are willing to tell the truth in a way that competes with the spectacle of the alternative, and whether we understand clearly enough how that spectacle is manufactured to stop treating exposure alone as a solution, none of which means archaeology has the pyramid solved. That distinction matters, and collapsing it is its own form of distortion. The previous sections have argued against specific false claims, against alien architects and Atlantean engineers and resonating energy chambers, and that argument is solid. The false claims fail on their own terms, by their own evidence, and the mechanisms by which they spread do not rehabilitate the content they carry. But clearing that ground does not mean every question is answered. The honest accounting of what we know has to include, clearly and without embarrassment, a parallel accounting of what we do not. Start with the interior of the Great Pyramid, because that is where the most visible open questions currently live. The 2025 confirmation of the North Face Corridor, a passage approximately 2 meters wide, 2 meters high, and 9 meters long, running beneath the chevron stones on the pyramid's north face, represents a genuine scientific achievement. Multimodal imaging combining muon tomography, ground-penetrating radar, ultrasonic scanning, and electrical resistivity produced a convergent picture of a real, air-filled space where no space was previously mapped with confidence. The result is peer-reviewed, replicated across methods, and published in scientific reports. That part is settled. What is not settled is what the passage is for. Scholars are actively divided. Some read it as a structural relief feature, a deliberate architectural choice to redistribute the enormous load bearing down on the pyramid's entrance, similar in function to the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. Others read it as the beginning of an unfinished chamber, a construction phase that was abandoned before it served any ceremonial or functional purpose. Others still consider a functional corridor, possibly related to access or to some aspect of the original burial program, that the historical record simply has not preserved. The dimensions have been confirmed, the interpretation has not, and the gap between those two things is not a minor footnote. It is a genuinely open question in the literature. The North Face Corridor is not alone. The Big Void, the large anomalous space detected above the Grand Gallery through muon tomography, and reported by the Scan Pyramids Project, remains incompletely mapped. The interior of the Great Pyramid is, despite everything the last decade of scanning has produced, still largely unknown in its full geometry. Mon tomography resolution improves as detector technology improves, but the current picture has limits. Some of the image fusion data for the North Face corridor itself shows dimensional variations of up to roughly half a meter between different scanning methods, which is not a small discrepancy when you are trying to determine whether a void is a corridor, a chamber, or something in between. Those methodological limits are not a scandal. They are a straightforward consequence of the physics involved and the state of current instrumentation. But they mean that the blueprint remains in revision, and any claim from any direction that the interior is now comprehensively understood is premature. Then there is the chronology, which is a quieter debate but a real one. The workers' village at Height El Ghurab provides the closest thing archaeology has to a direct window onto the people who built the Great Pyramid. The excavations there have been transformative. The evidence of a well-organized, well-fed, state-supported labor force is robust and consistent across multiple lines of inquiry: faunal remains, skeletal analysis, administrative debris, settlement layout. That core conclusion is not seriously contested. What carries uncertainty are the radiocarbon dates attached to specific features and phases of the settlement. Of the dates obtained from workers' village material, 3 cluster within the reign of Menkaure, the builder of the third pyramid at Giza, which falls in the range of 2532 to 2504 BCE. 5 other dates place the relevant activity somewhere between 350 and 100 years earlier than that, which would push some of the occupation back well before current historical reconstructions expect it. The most likely explanation for that scatter involves the Oldwood effect, the reuse of timber that was already aged when it was burned, producing carbon ages that reflect the tree's life rather than the moment of use. That is a well-understood sampling issue in radiocarbon work, not a conspiracy, but it means the occupational phases of the workers' village and their precise relationship to the reigns of specific pharaohs remain subjects of active calibration rather than settled agreement. The broad chronology is stable. The fine-grained sequence is not. This is, it should be said plainly, entirely normal. Archaeology does not produce certainty. It produces models that are progressively better supported or progressively revised as evidence accumulates. Every major site in the ancient world carries unresolved questions of function, sequence, and meaning that specialists argue about in journals and at conferences, not because they are hiding something but because the evidence is incomplete and interpretation is genuinely difficult. The pyramids are not unusual in having open questions. They are unusual in the scale of public attention those open questions receive, which means the gap between settled knowledge and live debate gets amplified in ways that the field studying, say, Bronze Age grain storage does not experience. What makes the pyramid questions particularly consequential is that the tools available for closing them are improving at a pace that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. Higher resolution muon detectors, tighter integration of geophysical imaging methods, advances in computational modeling of void geometry. These are not theoretical future capabilities, they are active research programs. The Scan Pyramids Consortium is not finished. The next scan may revise the blueprint again, just as the last scan revised it. That is not a reason for anxiety about archaeological knowledge. It is the normal operation of a field that takes evidence seriously enough to follow it when it moves. So here is where the line runs, as clearly as it can be drawn. On one side, the builders were ancient Egyptians, organized and directed by a state apparatus, working with practical engineering solutions that experimental archaeology has demonstrated and historical records corroborate. The Great Pyramid was built in roughly the right period, by roughly the right number of people, using methods that physics supports. That is consensus, and it is earned. On the other side, the full geometry of the interior is unknown. The function of newly detected voids is contested. and the fine chronology of the site carries uncertainties that have not been fully resolved. Those questions are open, and the next decade of scanning may close some of them, or open others. Both of those things can be true at the same time. In fact, both have to be true, because that is what the evidence actually shows. So where does that leave us? The pyramids are not solved. That has been said throughout this script, and it bears repeating here without apology, because intellectual honesty demands it. The function of the North Face corridor is contested. The full geometry of the Big Void is unresolved. The fine chronology of the workers' village carries margins of uncertainty that specialists are still calibrating. These are real gaps, and the people working to close them are doing so through muon tomography, multimodal image fusion, radiocarbon refinement, and experimental reconstruction, not through revelation, and not through speculation dressed as discovery. The gaps belong to science. The work of filling them is ongoing, and the tools doing that work are better today than they were 5 years ago, and will be better still 5 years from now. But here is the other side of that same ledger, and it deserves equal weight. Scanning technology has already confirmed a hidden corridor inside one of the most studied structures in human history, using convergent methods that independently arrived at the same result. Archaeology has already excavated a workers' village that produced high-protein diet evidence, medical treatment records, structured burials, administrative papyri, and DNA suggesting familial ties among the labor force. A picture so far from slave gangs that the two images barely share a category. Experimental reconstruction has already demonstrated that wet sand lubrication and coordinated sledges can move a 10-ton limestone block with a workforce operating well within the numbers historical records describe. The cardinal alignment of the Great Pyramid, precise to less than a 20th of a degree, has already been explained through simple stellar observation methods that require no instruments beyond a careful eye and a straight sightline. The evidence speaks. It speaks clearly, and it has been speaking for decades, growing louder as methods improve. The myths it contradicts, alien architects, Atlantean engineers, slave armies, resonating energy chambers, a deliberate star map encoding cosmic secrets, do not survive contact with that evidence, not because they are dismissed without examination, but because they have been examined and they fail. The Orion correlation is approximate and selective, matching only as well as a sufficiently flexible pattern applied to any sufficiently large field of points will match. The slave narrative is a historical misreading, amplified by sources that had no access to the site. The alien hypothesis is argument from incredulity, repackaged as investigation, and it collapses the moment the engineering is understood well enough to be mundane. What remains when those myths are cleared away is something harder to sensationalize and considerably more impressive. 20,000 to 30,000 people, organized and fed and housed and medically treated by a state that understood logistics well enough to sustain a construction effort across roughly 2 decades. Quarrymen, haulers, ramp builders, water carriers, administrators, physicians, bakers, a hierarchy of labor that translated a pharaoh's ambition into 146 meters of precisely aligned stone. The engineering was not magic, it was better than magic. It was competence at a scale and over a duration that required institutional coordination, accumulated expertise, and a social architecture capable of holding the whole enterprise together across years and across the deaths of the individuals who began it. That is the real achievement, not the mystery of how it was done. Though mystery is genuinely still present, and the voids not yet mapped, and the purposes not yet confirmed, the achievement is that human beings, working with the physics available to them and the tools they had developed, built something that has outlasted every civilization that has risen since. They did it without the help of the explanations that feel most convenient at a distance of 4,500 years. They did it because they were organized, skilled, and serious, and because the civilization that directed them had solved, at least temporarily, the problem of making very large numbers of people work together toward a single end. The pyramids are a record of that, not of contact with other worlds, not of a lost civilization whose memory has been buried beneath ours, not of technologies we have not yet recovered. A record of what human beings can do when the organization is there, the skill is there, and the ambition is large enough to carve its shape into stone that still stands. That is, if anything, the stranger story, and it happens to be true.